The Presidential Youth Employment Intervention says it believes that around 5 million young people in our country are now involved in some way with what's called the National Pathway Management Network. In other words, they're able to access services to help them become more employable, to find jobs. You'll know the number of young people without jobs is probably the biggest long-term problem we face as a society. Around 60% of the young people who leave school every year don't have a job or studying opportunity to go to. Waseem Carrim is the CEO of the National Youth Development Agency. Waseem, good afternoon to you. We see this intervention from the presidency. There are other interventions from your organisation and other parts of government to help young people into work. Do you believe they're actually working over the longer term?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the opportunity, and greetings to your viewers as well. So I think South Africa faces two challenges in relation to its youth unemployment crisis. One, we have a lack of a growing economy over a prolonged period of time, more than a decade now of very little economic growth in the economy. In fact, if you compare us, we compare to economies which are at war, like Afghanistan and Yemen, right? So we have to fix the macro issues in the economy. We have to get the economy growing at 4 or 5% a year. And this means addressing the big issues like energy, logistics, connectivity. And, you know, even the most conservative economists do believe that with the structural reforms that are being put in place, by 2025, 2026, we should start to see the impact of those reforms increasing the economic growth in the country. Now, the other challenge you face, which is more of, it's not a uniquely South African issue, it's a global issue, is that young people face barriers in entering the labor market as first-time work seekers. They face barriers in terms of experience, in terms of high costs of work seeking, data, transportation, and things like that there. And I think there's a feeling from the president and many others that young people can't be made to wait for structural changes in the economy to be able to feel like they are willing participants in this democracy, right? And that's partially why the Youth Employment Intervention was introduced, to break down some of the barriers that young people face in accessing opportunities through what you've mentioned, a national pathway management network. But also in terms of government and its private and public partners, introducing interventions like a National Youth Service, like a Youth Employment Service program, that give young people opportunities to gain experience and gain a better foothold in the labour market.
So, Waseem, I sort of understand the argument. On the one side, you've got you've got the idea that there are jobs available, the private sector needs people. On the other side, you've got young people, and what your organisation tries to do is provide the linkage. That's one of the things. But I don't think the linkage is the problem. And I say this because and we've seen from 2012, even before then, if Transnet would put out an advert, we need 200 people who do not have a skill for a job. And I remember this very clearly in Bloemfontein, there was a stampede. 10,000 people will arrive. The same thing happened with the Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi's offer of jobs for solar technicians, people to install solar panels. Thousands upon thousands of young people arrived. At the same time, the private sector has a skills shortage. And what that points to is we have the people, we have the brains, we have a skills shortage. What we really have is an education system that isn't working. And isn't that the problem?
So I think you make very critical points, right? We do face challenges on both the supply side and the demand side. But of course, the demand side issue is the major barrier at this point in time, right? Now, we know that South Africa's education system has positives. For example, we have fundamentally increased access to education. Almost every single child in South Africa starts grade 1. Where we seem to have a challenge is in terms of young people who actually finish the basic education system. Right? Now, a few years ago, that statistic was of every young person who started grade 1, only 1 in 2 of them would actually sit for their matric examination. Yeah? That has improved, right? We're getting that figure closer to 70% last year, which shows that over time we are seeing improvements in the basic education system, right? Similarly, in higher education, today South Africa produces 4 times the amount of black African graduates than it did in 1994. And we know, for example, that the graduate unemployment rate is far lower than the national unemployment rate, for example. Now, that doesn't mean everything in our skills system is working. One of the things that the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention has introduced is to say South Africa has invested a lot in skills development over a number of years. We know that the sector education training system, for example, has pumped millions and billions into the economy, right? With not necessarily seeing massive return on investment. However, we're thinking about, or we are implementing changes in the model, whereas before we had a heavy focus on accredited training, training for the sake of training, training for certification. What we're seeing more and more is that there needs to be training for actual demand in the economy. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Today in South Africa, we are the #1 destination for global business services. We are setting up call centers, data processing centers. We've overtaken countries like India and Indonesia. Now, it doesn't take that long to train a young person for a job in a call center or data processing center. And those are jobs that actually pay well above minimum wage in the economy, right? So by shifting the training model away from training for accreditation towards training for actual demand and shifting the risk for payment away from paying for training towards paying for placement in an actual job opportunity can shift our skills system towards actually placing young people where the skills gaps exist in the economy.
So there are other things to it, and you started off by suggesting that, in fact, we may start to see the impact of real structural change in 2 to 3 years. And I'm sorry to be cynical, but I've been promised by various politicians, all from the same party, structural reform for so many years that I'm afraid I don't know if I buy it anymore. I will grant you 2 things. I do think that Transnet will get fixed in the next year, and I do think Eskom may get fixed in the next 18 months. So that's probably, put that together, 3 percentage points of economic growth. That's a big change. That'll help. But in the end, I think it may require more than that. Let me put it to you in another way, and it's not your fault when I ask this question. But isn't it true that until we have a proper structural reform of our economy, the fundamental problem will remain? And I don't see, from the President's promise in 2017 of a social pact, I don't see any reason to believe why it will happen now while it hasn't happened in the past.
Yeah, look, I think you have every right to be cynical, right? And of course, a lot of these outcomes we'll see when South Africa goes to the polls next year, on whether government has delivered in terms of its mandate that it committed. Of course, we all hope that that structural growth does come in the economy, and we hope that that growth is inclusive in nature, right? We've also seen situations where growth benefits just an elite few in the economy. Right? So even when we have growth, we want it to be inclusive in nature. But growth doesn't exist in isolation. It requires fundamental building of state capacity. It requires a recognition of the changes that are required in the education system, that are required in the skilling system in South Africa. But I also think there's a greater role for government to play in the labor market. And I'll tell you why, right? I actually remember a piece you wrote just through the COVID-19 pandemic. And you mentioned an important point about what a employer of last resort, or what a minimum employment guarantee looks like, right? And I think South Africa's youth unemployment crisis is so acute and so heavy in nature that it does require a fundamental policy shift. Something like an employment guarantee, even if it's not universal at this stage, can still make a major impact. If you think about an employment guarantee that could reach 1 million young people, right? And we've shown through a number of these programs in the youth employment intervention, the Teachers Assistant Program, the Youth Service Program, that there is enough work on the demand side for young people to be able to do, yeah? And I think that kind of shift, I mean, we need to ask ourselves, how many more times are we going to bail out the post office in South Africa before we realize that's not a thing that's working, right? And that money is far better invested in giving young people experience in the labor market that enables them to gain a foothold and move more in a more reasonable pathway through the labor market, yeah?
Waseem Carrim, thank you. CEO of the National Youth Development Agency. Really do appreciate the time.